That's the only region lockout there is. So if you just whittle down those, like, pegs in your cartridge slot, you can play any region's games perfectly fine. Well, PAL games don't work because PAL games are weird, but again, it's kind of for the same reason stuff plays really weak here. Now, here's a hot take that is completely exclusive to me, completely fresh. No one has ever said anything as prolific as this ever, nor will they ever again. The PlayStation Classic is a bit crap. I mean, as long as you leave it completely stock as Sony intended. Oh, wink. I think most people probably bought the PlayStation Classic expressly for the purposes of playing Final Fantasy VII for the million, billion, squillionth time. But as an actual hot take from me, I don't actually like Final Fantasy VII, like at all. And in fact, I think it's kind of the embodiment of everything wrong with this series today. No, instead, when I bought my PlayStation Classic at a Goodwill for like $30, the first reason is because I didn't have a PlayStation back in the day. I'm actually pretty illiterate for this system, and I really do need to get more PlayStation 1 games out there. I really do, and that's something I really aspire to do sometime in the near future. The second reason is because this has Wild Arms on it, and I freaking love Wild Arms. Again, maybe it's because I'm not that familiar with the system, but it is an RPG I absolutely love on the system. It's iconic for me. And the final specific reason why I got my PlayStation Classic, and most relevant here, is Jumping Flash. Because Jumping Flash is weird. Like, if I were to write down everything about this on a list of paper, you'd look at me and say, that's dumb, that would never work, that's bad. It's a first-person platformer. You know, that genre that to this day we still haven't really nailed down all that well. It's an early 3D platformer, which is in and of itself very concerning. And it's a very, very early PlayStation game. All of those things to me scream red flags, this is going to be really rough, and yet it's remarkable how legit this game is. I actually really quite like Jumping Flash, and I would say, for me, again, as someone who is completely illiterate with this system, feel free to help supply me with better games so that I get better familiar with this system, but it was remarkable to me and was absolutely worth the purchase of this. It was a great experience, with maybe one exception, and that's more of Sony mucking with things that they shouldn't have, because again, the PlayStation Classic is a piece of garbage, and not a problem of the game itself. The story features the evil Baron Aloha, dastardly villain who's stealing chunks of different planets so that he can build himself a mega super ultimate resort and make a lot of money doing so. Galactic City Hall, figure that one out, isn't too happy with this, so they send their ultimate hero, Robbit, the robot rabbit, who's yellow in the last game for some reason that we never got. So I've got that one. Yeah, they send Robbit to go stop him, and that's kind of it. There really isn't much story here, and it's goofy and silly, and it's really part of the game's charm, I think. I do think there is one weird thing about the story, though. Like, in between, like, the actual stages, you get these weird interstitial scenes where these little octopus guys known as Mumus, they're sort of Baron Aloha's henchmen. You don't really see them too often in the actual game, though. They're just sitting at a tavern drinking and just chatting it up. And I think they're supposed to be, like, talking about how, Robbit's so awesome and how we keep foiling their plans or something, but you can't really hear much, and I swear, like, every scene is basically the same scene, just shot from a different angle of the bar, and everyone just has, like, the same very lame 2 seconds of animation. They're not well animated, they don't add to the story, they don't really do anything other than take up space. And I mean, if that space could have been saved for adding extra levels or something, I think that would have been a big plus, because this game isn't that long. That said, the story itself is cute, it's goofy, it's charming, and I think it is absolutely strange, but it adds to the sort of silliness of this game, and I definitely appreciate that. Now, the gameplay to Jumping Flash is relatively simple. You are put into a 3-dimensional environment with your goal being to collect 4 things that look suspiciously like carrots but aren't actually carrots, called rocket pods. These rocket pods ostensibly keep the bits of the resort floating, so once you remove them, then they go back to where they came from. Or they crash into like the nearby planet or fly into a black hole and, kill everyone. Not your problem. You're here to get rid of the rocket pods, not worry about the aftermath. To do so, you're going to have to platform around the environments, and This is where things get very interesting because it takes place in the first-person perspective, and first-person platforming, even today, is a bit of an iffy endeavor. I mean, I've played those Mirror's Edge games, and those are, they kind of work, but they're not great. Part of the issue with first-person platforming is, of course, figuring out where your feet are, and this game actually does something rather ingenious. When you kind of hit the apex of your jump, the camera automatically pans downward to see exactly where you're going to land, so you always know exactly where you're going to be and where you're going to land, and that's absolutely brilliant. Combine that with the fact that you have a double jump, and that means you can kind of get around anywhere relatively easily. The platforming in this is really smooth and nice, and the only real issue I have with it is I found that the double jump itself is a little bit iffy to trigger. Like, you have to trigger it at pretty much the apex of your first jump or it just won't go. But just the fact that they thought, okay, in order to make sure we know where we're going in this environment and the player is never at any point confused or, you know, unsure of where they're going to land or if they're even going to land in a playable space, we're just going to automatically take camera control and show them exactly where they're going to land so they have full control using two-dimensional inputs into a three-dimensional game. That's a stroke of brilliance right there. That is a simple solution for a very complex problem that even today we sometimes struggle with. I really do appreciate it, and it makes the core platforming mechanics of this game ridiculously easy to control and smooth. What I found particularly interesting about this game, mechanically speaking though, is even though this is absolutely a first-person platformer, it isn't completely married to that format. There's a few levels that are actually indoors in small caves and mazes where you can't really jump around or anything, and even then it works really well as sort of a first-person sort of maze exploration game slash shooter. I will say that at some of the later points in the game, the mazes and stages are a little harder to navigate because they get more complex as time goes on, but for the most part, it's just kind of remarkable how fun it is to explore these environments, even when you're not actually platforming around. And I think it's kind of bold to say, hey, we're going to take this game that is a platformer and take all the platforming out of it for a stage or two just to, you know, see what that's like. It works surprisingly well and just adds to the diversity of this gameplay. You also have a couple of weapons. You have your standard laser as well as, I believe, 3 or 4 different pickups all themed around fireworks, even though not all of them are explosive. Some of them, like the spinner, are basically completely useless, and others, like the Roman candle, which are 2 very large death lasers, are basically the greatest thing ever, and you don't need any other weapon other than that. You can stockpile weapons. It's a little tricky to look for specific things, and usually, like, I end up with weapons I don't want because those spinners, like I said, are pretty much useless, but you can hold a couple of things at once and pull them out from when you really need them, like the bosses and stuff. There's also a couple other power-ups and pickups in between. There was one that I don't know if it gave me invulnerability, but it certainly made the screen flash all the colors at once and made it really hard to stream, but, you know, there was LSD mode for a little bit for some reason. And, you know, playing with these different tools and using them to attack enemies, on top of the fact that you can just, you know, platform on enemies, which seem to be one of the more effective ways to deal with some of the larger bosses later on. It was fun to play with these toys in these huge stage-like environments. Every couple of stages has a boss, and they are these huge monsters that are, for the most part, not actually all that hard to beat. I did find one of them to be a little bit tricky, but that's more because its hitbox was a little bit hard to find. But for the most part, the bosses are just a matter of either, you know, use your giant Roman candle lasers or jump on their head a whole bunch. The bosses are not the high point of this game, I will say that. There's a couple of bonus stages as well, which involve popping balloons and utilizing your weapons to the fullest capacity in order to do that under a set period of time. And it's just a nice little break from the main gameplay of running around looking for carrots. And that's great. The environments are relatively varied, and there's just a lot to see and do in this game. And it does get progressively harder as you go. I know later on, you actually end up landing on these really, like, teensy tiny little platforms every now and then, and it's just, it's a little bit scary, but, you know, it's a lot of fun. I think the core gameplay to Jumping Flash is excellent. The only real core issue I've found with this game is that the GUI seems a little bit over-designed. Like, it has this sort of, like, almost sort of tunnel vision visor effect so that you can't see, like, the corners of your screen that takes up maybe 10-20% of total visual real estate that probably could just be taken off entirely. That little bouncy thing in the middle of your screen, that's an actual indicator of how many jet pods you found, which I didn't figure out until way later in my playthrough, and honestly, the fact that it's animated and the fact that it's, you know, stylized the way it is, it's really unclear what it's there for, and it just takes up space, and it's just distracting more than anything. I think they could really clean up the UI, and it'd be a much, much better experience. But at the same time, I think you would be also taking away a little bit of the charm, but for the sake of playability, I think I would prefer it. The stages themselves feature a great deal of verticality in how the jet pods are hidden, and sometimes even have them hidden on like little islands way off the main land. Unfortunately, this draws a bit of a little lost as to where I was supposed to go because I could not see anywhere where a jet pod was, but for the most part the stage designs work really, really well, and they are very, very creative. Now, the big issue I found while playing Jumping Flash is, again, nothing to do with Jumping Flash. It has to do with how I played it on the PlayStation Classic. And this once again goes back to Sony not really caring when they made this piece of junk. They used the PAL ROM. Now, if you're not familiar, basically this game runs at 50 Hz as opposed to 60 Hz. The difference basically being how it was displayed for TVs at the time, because North American TV displays were a little bit different than European ones. And this basically means that we are playing with effectively a lower frame rate than it should be, and I will say that it did feel like my inputs were getting eaten every now and then. Certainly the double jumps were a little bit tricky, and I noticed that there was like some slowdown sometimes just before jumps. It wasn't fantastic, and it didn't break the game in any meaningful way, but it just hurts the experience as a whole when you know that there is an objectively better running version of this out there that Sony just chose not to include for some reason. And that's really one of the worst things about this game. It's one of the few really objectively bad things. It's just, I know there's a better version of this out there. Why is it not on here? It's weird and bad, and Sony really felt like they were phoning this entire thing in, which is why I don't think too many people are all that enthused about having one, and I could understand that. The stock PlayStation Classic is at best a minimum viable product with minimal effort. And, you know, on the PlayStation Classic as a whole, this would be a huge problem on something like Tekken, which is, you know, a fighting game that also used the PAL ROM. That also means, you know, playing it at a relatively, you know, solid, consistent frame rate is kind of impossible, and that's a problem. And while it's a small thing, it was enough to sort of throw off my inputs a little bit and made the experience lesser for it. And this was a decision Sony made for seemingly no real reason. They were really inconsistent with the ROM types they used and the regions they used, and there was no real benefit to doing it the way they did, and only really lessened the value of their product. And it's a shame because Jumping Flash is really, really fun. It's slightly harder to play because the way Sony decided to release it for no real benefit to themselves. But Jumping Flash as an individual game, ignoring how I had to play it, is in and of itself pretty remarkable. It stands out as a testament that first-person platforming can actually be intuitive and fun, and even with, you know, clunky controls such as like the old PlayStation controller, it still works and holds up pretty well today, I think. It's kind of surprising that first-person platforming has kind of regressed, considering that this is, for its time, so incredibly competent, and even today we're kind of having issues with first-person platforming, but, you know, I think this game is remarkable, and it did do well enough to make 2 sequels and a spin-off. You know, it's doing something right, and I have to say it's a fun game, and it doesn't outstay its welcome. It's not a long game. I honestly think it could be significantly longer before it ever got boring, but yeah, I think that it is a fun, sweet, and just in general a feel-good game with a nice, succinct campaign. The overall presentation to Jumping Flash is really high quality. Visually, all the sort of strange, fragmented island worlds that you run around in are all distinct and all very interesting. They have their own unique traps and tricks to them that you have to kind of avoid or utilize to your advantage. The game features many unique enemies, and the bosses are all very distinct, and I do quite like how this game looks. The texture work is quite good as well. Audio-wise, I think it's pretty fantastic as well. The soundtrack is upbeat and peppy. While I don't think I would necessarily listen to anything on my spare time, I think it works excellently as it helps to create an atmosphere of a light, fluffy, and upbeat, energetic adventure. It works excellently. Overall, the presentation to Jumping Flash is excellent. Now, if you want a copy of Jumping Flash on the Sony PlayStation, cheapest copy I'm seeing, in English anyway, on eBay, is about $60, which is fairly expensive for what you're getting. Like I said, it's a pretty succinct and not terribly long campaign, but I do think it is quite good and definitely worth it. There are Japanese copies that are significantly cheaper, however, and I don't think language would really be any real issue in this game. So, you know, if you can play an imported copy, that might be the way to go, with a Japanese physical copy being about 1/3 the price. That said, I believe this game was also one of those like long box games in North America, and I love those PS1 long box games. I want to collect all of them because they remind me of the Saturn boxes. So you'd be missing out on that. Now, if you want a more affordable way of playing Jumping Flash, you still have a couple other options. It was made available on PSN on the PS3. However, you know, Sony is slowly phasing that out and of course making it more and more difficult to even interact with that. So if you want it there, you're going to have to act quick and you're going to have to jump through hoops to even be able to access that, which is certainly annoying. Thanks, Sony, for that. And it is available on PS4's like premium tier subscription service that is way too expensive to be justifiable in any meaningful way, but you can get it there, I guess, as a bonus. I wouldn't recommend it for that price, but you can do it. Either way, Jumping Flash is the game that made me want to go out and get a PlayStation Classic. Now, it's basically just the modding scene that makes me want to play this thing, but, you know, it was an interesting game that really, for all accounts, shouldn't have worked half as well as it did, but it did work well. It worked well enough to get 2 sequels and a spin-off, and, you know, I think it's cute, it's light, and it's a good feel-good game with a lot of fun mechanics. And despite the fact it was such an early PlayStation game, despite the fact it was 3D platforming at such an early stage, and it was first-person, it works within those limitations very, very well, and I think it holds up. Honestly, I think Jumping Flash is kind of an awesome little game for the system, and if you haven't given it a shot, maybe you should. Granted, again, I am basically PS1 illiterate, and I really need to work on my PS1 collection. Again, you know, feel free to give me some tips, and or, you know, if you want to help me with my collection, you know, it's always appreciated, and it would help me understand this system a little bit better, because I'm really not that well versed in it. But I will say that Jumping Flash is definitely a pretty remarkable game, and I think it holds up really, really well, in spite of the fact that it's on very, very old hardware, or in my case, very, very poorly made minimum viable products. That said, the PlayStation Classic in general is pretty much just a piece of tat, and I've seen significantly better pirate consoles that have done so much more than this thing does. But Jumping Flash is excellent, and if you are looking for some interesting PS1 stuff, you might want to hop on Jumping Flash. Ready to go? Ah, that's fine.